What was your impression of America when you grew up in this exceptional, especially in the kind of mid to late 20th century, where the peak of U.S. abundance and all of the violence that had hoarded everything in? You know, people forget that the poor of the world are poor because they've been robbed. They haven't been left behind by capitalism.
They haven't worked hard enough.
Right.
Yeah, I grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s when the economy was booming, and we had guests, veterans come to speak to us at our school about how necessary war was and why it was important. And a lot of us had questions like, well, why during a war do we see America going into other countries and bombing the civilians there, but the same thing doesn't happen here? That was a question I asked in second grade when we had a troop from Desert Storm come speak to our class.
Whoops.
And I got a week of counseling. I had to talk to puppets called No-No and Do-So the dolphin and No-No the dragon about what types of questions and how to behave and what's appropriate in the classroom.
Wow.
Very effective, I see.
Wow, that's incredible.
They got to you.
Wow.
Yeah, so these are, even in watching cartoons as a child in America, you, like Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, when they have a war and they hold up the war sign, it's back and forth, back and forth. So I think it's suspicious when we talk about war and it doesn't even look like the picture of war that's been painted for us in history books.
Today we spend the hour looking at a damning new report that reveals how U.S.-led airstrikes against Islamic State militants in Iraq have killed far more civilians than officials have acknowledged. An on-the-ground investigation by the New York Times Magazine titled The Uncounted found the actual civilian death toll may be 31 times higher than the U.S. is admitting. In fact, the report reveals that as many as 1 in 5 coalition airstrikes on ISIS targets in Iraq resulted in civilian deaths. The reporters write, quote, "In terms of civilian deaths, this may be the least transparent war in recent American history."
In Somalia, an investigation by the website The Daily Beast provides new details on how U.S. Special Forces and Somali troops carried out a raid last August in which 10 people were shot dead, including 3 children, in a village near the capital, Mogadishu. The investigation found that U.S. soldiers fired on unarmed civilians, relied on shoddy intelligence, and ordered their Somali counterparts to plant weapons by the bodies of the unarmed civilians they'd just killed. The Daily Beast also reports that U.S. diplomats pressured Somalia's government to bury the findings of its investigation into the killings.
But my point here is that the country is for the first time worried about the Muslim movement. It shouldn't be worried about the Muslim movement. That's not the problem. The problem is to eliminate the conditions which breed the Muslim movement.
Saudi Arabia is continuing to block food and medicine from being delivered to Yemen, which is facing the world's worst humanitarian crisis after years of war. 7 million Yemenis face famine. The UN says some 900,000 people have been infected with cholera. On Tuesday, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut took to the floor of the Senate to criticize the U.S. for its support of the Saudi-led war in Yemen.
It is U.S. refueling planes flying in the sky around Yemen that restock the Saudi fighter jets with fuel, allowing them to drop more ordnance. It is U.S. made and transferred ordnance that is carried on these planes and are dropped on civilian and infrastructure targets inside Yemen. The United States is part of this coalition. The bombing campaign that has caused the cholera outbreak could not happen without us.
It's amazing how powerful the propaganda has held, that America is good. And this goes back, of course, to Bernays in the 20th century. I mean, it's really the entire 20th century where the U.S. creates this, starting with World War I, World War II, this image of itself as the great nation that's going to save others. And Vietnam and Korea and Grenada and 2 Iraq wars haven't managed to stain that image in the minds of a lot of people who aren't necessarily paying attention or astute.
Yeah. In the minds of Americans, however, when you look at the rest of the world, America is the biggest threat to their security. I mean, it's amazing.
Gallup poll.
Yeah.
Global 66
Yeah.
countries.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's amazing. No one talks about that.
Right.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah, and I think that, that Summer's experience is really all of our experience, right?
Yep.
We grew up with a heavy indoctrination.
Yep.
And, of course, why is that? I think that we know that we have the biggest military budget.
The House has passed a $700 billion military budget.
It's really hard to wrap your head around the actual size and scale and reach of that. The size of the U.S. military dwarfs all of the rest of the major powers combined. Like the size of the Navy, the number of military bases around there, like no other country has this vast network of bases all over the globe. We're the only ones that do it. And the amount of military spending, so all these problems we see at home, we see just endless money, trillions of dollars, immediately can be dumped into wars, but there's no money for things here. Right. So this is the propaganda, but what is the story that's justifying this huge military spending and also wars all over the place? It's this idea that Summer's talking about, is that we grow up thinking that all U.S. military intervention, this is about human rights and democracy, bringing it to the rest of the world. That's the story. Yeah. And they tell us who our enemies are, right? Our enemy is in Iraq, our enemy's in Cuba, our enemy's in Venezuela. They list who the enemies are, and they also tell us who our friends are. Our friends are Saudi Arabia, our friends are Israel, So when you really look at what the story is, that it's about human rights and democracy, if you line up who our enemies are and who our friends are, or friends of the U.S. empire, it completely contradicts that. Yeah. But what those things do have in common, enemies of the United States empire, what they have in common is an economy that doesn't just bow to the United States. Mm-hmm. And their friends, doesn't matter how awful their human rights are, it doesn't matter if they're a democracy or the worst dictatorship on the planet, if they bow to U.S. economic interests, then they're okay. So really it's kind of obvious what it's all about.
Right.
Yeah.
According to the National Priorities Project, U.S. military expenditures are roughly the size of the world's next 7 largest military budgets combined. Meanwhile, a new study has found the amount spent by the U.S. on wars since the September 11th attacks in 2001 will top more than $5.6 trillion by the end of the fiscal year. According to the Brown University-based Costs of War project, the average U.S. taxpayer has spent over $23,000 to pay for the U.S. wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, and other countries.
This is being done, after all, not 100 years ago, in a country which is blessed with what we call prosperity, a word we won't examine too closely, with a certain kind of social coherence, which calls itself a civilized nation and which espouses the notion of the freedom of the world.
In the words of violence researcher Dr. James Gilligan once again, every single year, 2 to 3 times as many people die from poverty throughout the world as were killed by the Nazi genocide of the Jews over a 6-year period. That is, in effect, the equivalent of an ongoing, unending, and, in fact, accelerating thermonuclear war or genocide perpetuated on the weak and poor every year of every decade throughout the world. Meanwhile, as Abby pointed out, as of 2015, 62 people have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the entire world population. There are about 1,800 billionaires in the world as of 2015, with over $7 trillion between them. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations calculated that it would only take roughly $30 billion a year to solve world hunger through mostly developmental programs in poor regions. Not only could the billionaires do this for 200 years and still be wealthy, which wouldn't even be necessary because it's about development, not just piecemeal aid. Only a tiny fraction, of course, of U.S. annual military spending would suffice as well, as we've heard. Recognizing this deeply impoverished value disorder, former FAO director stated, "Against that backdrop, how can we explain to people of good sense and good faith that it was not possible to find U.S. $30 billion a year to enable 862 million hungry people to enjoy the most fundamental of human rights, the right to food and thus the right to life?"
It's not just about civilians either. The Pentagon's the biggest polluter on the planet, hands down. And so when you talk about climate change, it's kind of a joke.
Sure.
When we're living in an empire that has complete callous disregard for the environment, and the Navy's doing exercises all the time in the ocean with quadrillion billion particles of plastic just polluting the shit out of the entire world. So it's disgusting.
It is.
Yeah, and it's, this real toxic enemy we have in the United States, which is nationalism, right? And it's just like indoctrinating people like we have some kind of common interest. Everyone who lives in America, in the United States, we're in common cause together, rich and poor. And that people in other countries, they're another nation. Nationalism is for us. But I think that, like I'm a veteran of the Iraq War, and like the experience of knowing, so many people in Iraq who then became anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist from that experience, it's because of shedding that nationalism, of saying, okay, like I'm in Iraq, and I see people have a hard life here, and I grew up having a hard life. That's why I joined the military. I feel like I have a lot in common with these people, but who I don't have anything in common with is like millionaires like George Bush and Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, who would tell us that we have to go here for our common interests of our nation. And so I think that it's easy for that veil to come off, shedding that nationalism, this like patriotic BS, and embracing like, internationalism.
Everything in the world, Jimmy, needs to be seen in the context of the U.S. empire. We are the largest, most destructive empire in the world. That's why I love your show and how you constantly call attention to the military budget, because all this shit doesn't matter. Like, every domestic issue has to be seen through the lens of the empire. Every international issue has to be seen through the lens of the empire, because the world is split into colonized and colonizers, and the riches that have been accumulated through the first world nations have been on the backs of those countries that have been colonized. So the framing of, the context of world issues has to be seen through that lens.
People don't realize, we just had Judah Friedlander on the show, who's one of my favorite comedians from 30 Rock, and he said as he traveled around the world, he got to see history from a different perspective. He said, when you're in Vietnam, they don't call it the Vietnam War. He said they call it the war with the Americans.
Right.
So talk about how we're fighting terrorism, yet there is no doubt that we are the biggest cause, we are the biggest purveyors of terrorism in the world. Look what we did to Iraq alone.
Oh my God.
And no one ever talks about that. Could you imagine if another country, an Arab country, took over America, occupied it, killed hundreds of thousands of people? That's real terror. That's what we did.
Right.
So in other words, the biggest crutch to the evolution of human thought is breaking your own indoctrination. It's very, very difficult to overcome emotional elements that have become so ingrained in you that you have an immediate reaction, an immediate suffering and pain when anything interferes with that. It's a very, very complex problem. But I'll say it again. We have to learn how to we have to learn how to identify and break our own indoctrination if we expect to move forward at all as a civilization.